Chapter 1. He knew why they called him Wulf. It was for the necklace his mother had left him with, when she'd placed him on the chapel steps as a baby. The wolf's head coin was on a leather cord that he still wore tucked under his tunic and breastplate. It was more than that, though. It was as if his mother had fated something upon him by placing that cord around his neck. His hair was coarse and thick, bristling like a wolf's hackles, and peppered with white among the brown, even though he was only a few years above 20. He currently wore it long, pulled into a tail when he was working. His eyes were a yellow-brown, sharp and quick-sighted. Wulf rarely missed anything, from a new face in Castletown to a slim, tanned hand slipping into his fellow guardsman's pocket. "Hey now," he growled, catching the wrist of the street urchin and pulling him away. The boy glared up at him, eyes narrowed in defiance. He very deliberately spat at Wulf, the spittle splattering against his breastplate. Wulf jerked back, but he didn't let go of the urchin's wrist. "Stop that," he snapped. Wulf didn't recognize him, but then he didn't recognize half of the kids he saw nowadays. So many people had flooded into the town over the last few years, as farms failed with a poor harvest 2 years running, and their subsistence being taken for the king's stores. Wulf scanned the market square, if he could find someone who could take guardianship of the kid. Too late. His partner, Julian, had finally roused himself enough to notice the noise. Julian turned, grinning at the kid. "Caught a sneak thief, did you, Wulf?" The kid's face went from defiant to pale in an instant. Julian's sneering grin was enough to make anyone uncomfortable, but framed by the beast head helmet of the city guard, the look was even more sinister. Wulf fought the urge to wrap his arm around the kid's shoulders. What did the little urchin think would happen? That he'd get away with pickpocketing one of the guard? Julian glanced at Wulf, then reached for the whip coiled at his belt. The kid made a panicked squeak and kicked Wulf on the side of his shin. Wulf yelped and let go of the kid's wrist. The urchin dashed down an alley and was gone in an instant. Julian frowned. "You shouldn't let them go like that. He kicked me. It couldn't have been that bad. It was half on your greave." Wulf suppressed a grin. It hadn't hurt, but it had been a good excuse. He leaned over and rubbed his leg, grumbling under his breath. After a moment, Julian rolled his eyes and leaned back against the empty market booth they stood by, resettling his spear in the crook of one arm. Wulf straightened. "What would you do to them, Julian? A beating isn't going to help, not when half the kids in the city are starving. And once they've offended multiple times, you can hardly string up a kid on the gallows just because they're hungry. Last I hear, a kid's neck will stretch as easily as an adult's," Julian growled. He poked Wulf in the shoulder. "You watch yourself, mate. You're starting to sound like you sympathize with them. Going soft. You know what happens to those who go soft." Wulf held back a sigh and rubbed a hand along the back of his neck. "You're right," he said quietly. "Maybe a lash or two would do them good." He had to swallow down the disgust that rose in his gut to say it, but Julian was right. Captain Royce thought he'd weeded out all the men like Wulf a long time ago, those who couldn't handle crushing any sedition under the heels of their boots, even if the sedition looked as tame as someone whispering that the king worked them too hard or taxed them too much. Wulf turned his attention back to the market square. No one seemed to have noticed the kid, even though he and Julian stood alone at the entrance to the square. It was quiet today, like most other market days since the drought. A few stalls stood open at the far end next to the dry, cracked marble fountain. A small knot of 20 or so townsfolk browsed the stalls, or stood in knots of 2 and 3 to gossip and chat. All of them seemed to be doing their level best to ignore him and Julian, which suited Wulf just fine. He'd spent the first couple of years of the new king's reign getting cursed and spat at, as the penalties for breaking the smallest laws got harsher and harsher. The townsfolk couldn't reach the king, but they could reach the city guard. Although since the fire in the west quarter a year ago, the townsfolk had seemed more cowed. The curses and spittle had died down to glares and mutters as guardsmen walked past. Wulf hadn't been one of the ones setting the fires. He swallowed again, trying to rephrase the thought in his head. Dealing with the insurrectionists, Captain Royce would phrase it. Even in his private thoughts he had to take care. He scanned the stall's meager offerings, noting the withered root vegetables and fruits. There were certainly plenty of wild berries and foraged greens on offer, thankfully. Summer was a blessing for the commoners, because even the king's take didn't extend to what everyone but the needy considered to be weeds. Wulf was mildly surprised that there were any berries for sale at all. Usually the best foods went to the castle, though they certainly didn't end up in the barracks kitchen. Julian leaned against the market stall, packing his pipe full of tobacco. The summer sun was harsh, beating down on them both, heating the inside of Wulf's metal breastplate and helmet, until he felt like he was sitting in the hot springs that fed the barracks bathhouse. He shuffled back into the shade of the wall and pulled off his helmet, tucking it under one arm. He wiped his forehead, leaving a slick of sweat along his forearm. His hair was plastered to the back of his neck. He lifted his ponytail away from his back. "Gonna get in trouble with Captain Royce if he sees you out of uniform," Julian muttered. "I don't think even the captain would fancy his guards cooked inside their armor," Wulf replied. He scanned the market stalls again. "I'm going to buy a basket of berries." "Wouldn't trust that they aren't spit on," Julian said. "I think I can endure a little spit. When's the last time you had sun-ripened berries?" Wulf shot back. He stepped toward the stalls, jingling the purse at his side to make his purpose clear. The shoppers eyed him suspiciously, but let him pass unmolested as he made his way to the stall with the berries. Wulf smiled at the old farmer, and was gratified to have her smile in return. He looked through her offerings, all presented in small, hand-woven pine needle baskets. Blackberries, dewberries, strawberries, and raspberries all glistened in the sun, all of them looking fat and succulent. Wulf picked out a basket of mixed dewberries and raspberries, his favorites, and handed over a copper to the woman. "Bless you, Almsson," she said, slipping the coin into her apron. He hadn't realized she knew his name. Wulf smiled at her and was about to turn away when he noticed the parchment pinned to the price board of an abandoned stall a few steps away. Wulf stepped toward it, and out of the corner of his eyes he noticed the crowd around him stiffen. His stomach sank as he quickly read the bold letters inked on the parchment. "A king who steals from his own people is no king at all. Down with the pretender. Stand up for yourself and your family." As Wulf stared at the parchment, the breeze blew from the west, bringing the smell of long burning fires to his nose. He bit the inside of his lower lip. "Wulf," Julian called. "What is it?" "It's—" Wulf turned, started to shout back that it wasn't anything for Julian to concern himself with. Emotion caught his eyes across the square. The town potion maker, Ari, and her granddaughter, Diane, were standing at one of the far booths. While Ari was busy negotiating, Wulf saw Diane's hand slip something parchment-colored into the bag at her side. His stomach twisted into a knot. "Diane, I'd warned you." "Wulf?" In his distraction, Julian had walked up beside him. His eyes darted to the sign, and in an instant his face twisted into a scowl. He ripped the parchment free, crumpling it in his fist. His voice boomed over the square. "Who put this up here?" The conversation in the square died. The townsfolk all turned to face them, some of them stepping back so they were all huddled in one group, several steps away from the two city guards. Wulf's stomach knotted as he scanned their faces. These were mostly women, children, a few young or old men, just trying to feed their families. "Julian," he said, putting his hand on his partner's arm. Julian shrugged away and took a step toward the crowd. "Do you think this is funny?" He held the crumpled parchment up in a clenched fist. "Who is spreading treason against our king?" When no one spoke, Julian lunged at a nearby woman and knocked a basket out of her hand, scattering fresh berries across the ground. The woman flinched back from Julian, one hand covering her mouth. An older man stepped forward, holding his hands up. "Peace, guardsman. We know nothing of this treason." Liar! As Julian continued to shout his abuse, Wulf noticed several people in the crowd glancing over at him. He hunched his shoulders, folding his arms over his chest. As much as he wanted to stop Julian from doing anything, he knew that stepping in would risk his job. There were only so many times Julian, or the captain, would tolerate disobedience of the laws. "I didn't tell you that you could leave," Julian shouted. Wulf looked up. Ari and Diane had taken a few steps away from the fringes of the crowd, edging for a street exit. Julian shoved his way through the crowd and stepped in front of them, glaring at them. "Ari, isn't it?" he sneered. "The apothecary." Years of sitting at a workbench brewing potions had left Ari hunched and in need of a cane, but few dared to call her old or feeble to her face. She stared levelly up at Julian, her black eyes snapping. "Aye? And is this your granddaughter?" Julian's eyes roved over Diane, and his lips twisted. "What's your name, love?" Wulf's fingers tightened into fists. "Diane," she replied, her tone as calm and brisk as her grandmother's. If Julian had been expecting her to blush or look away, like so many of the women did when they caught the attention of a guardsman, he'd tried to pick the wrong woman. "Why were you attempting to leave?" Julian demanded, taking another step toward Diane. Her back stiffened. "My grandmother can't stand for long. It's her hip. She needs to go home." "Don't you care, Diane, about the treasonous words found in this market?" Julian asked, his voice soft and dangerous. "Don't you care that we might have a dangerous rebel in our midst, disrupting the peace of our home?" Someone in the crowd said loudly, "Reading a parchment ain't treason, guardsman." Julian turned to face the crowd, his hand going to the whip at his belt. He let the knots at the end of the leather slip through his fingers as he stared, trying to find the speaker. "Isn't it? I don't know that the king's law agrees with your assessment." He stepped forward, gripping the shoulder of a young man. "Let's see if you rebels can remain cowards, eh?" Wulf let out a groan under his breath, then stepped forward. He grabbed Julian's arm, stopping him from uncoiling his whip. "That's enough. We can't start beating random people for a crime no one has committed." Julian's grip on the boy's shoulder loosened, and he glanced at Wulf. Wulf swallowed hard at the sight of the rage and, even worse, the feverish glee alight in Julian's eyes. He could feel the way Julian trembled under his grip, like a bloodthirsty animal on a leash, waiting for the signal to tear into an innocent. Wulf pushed him back another step, his fist tightening in a twist of Julian's shirt sleeve, not dropping his gaze from Julian's eyes. After a moment, Julian looked away, his body slouching. Wulf relaxed his grip and turned to the crowd. "Go home. Curfew starts now." He made eye contact with Diane, long enough to let her know that he'd seen her, that his words were meant for her. "Go home." He could hear soft grumbling as the crowd dispersed. Curfew was already at sunset, and he'd just started it 2 hours early. No one would be happy with him about that. There was still plenty of daylight for shopping, gardening, feeding animals, and he'd ruined that. Wulf waited until the last townsfolk had disappeared from the square before releasing Julian's shirt. "Let's go," he said, turning away. "We need to spread the word of the early curfew and tell the captain about the poster before—" Julian hit him hard in the lower back. Wulf staggered forward, dropping his helmet as he flailed to stay upright. His hip hit the edge of a stall counter, and he grabbed at it, bracing his hands on the splintering wooden surface. He took a second, catching his breath, then turned, still leaning against the stall. He could already feel a deep ache spreading up his side, foretelling an ugly bruise. Julian stood flexing his fists for a moment, glowering at him. "You let them go," he stated. Wulf nodded slowly. "You can't—" Julian grabbed the rim of Wulf's breastplate, shoving him back against the stall again, hard enough that Wulf's head snapped against the boards. He gritted his teeth to hold back a yelp of pain. "You've always been a sympathizer," Julian snarled. "I've put up with this long enough. But if you're going to start letting treason slide, let go of me." The ice Wulf put in his tone was, thankfully, enough to make Julian back off a little. Wulf straightened, holding back a wince as scrapes on his back rasped against his rough tunic. "You can't beat an entire square of townsfolk, Julian," Wulf said quietly. You might have gotten a few lashes in, but sooner or later they were going to realize we were only 2 guardsmen. You can't push people to their breaking limit. So you're saying you're a coward, that it was self-preservation. I'm saying it was common sense. Bullshit. Julian jabbed his finger into Wulf's chest. I saw you the night the western quarter burned. I saw the tears on your face as the houses collapsed. You were letting people flee right past you. What was I supposed to do? Shove people back into the blaze? Wulf's throat tightened. He could still taste the smoke thick on his tongue and feel the heat of the alchemical fire on his skin. He thought he'd been safe in that moment, that he could let the splinters in his loyalty show. At least Julian hadn't seen the times he'd stepped into the quarter to help people get out. We were supposed to be weeding out Blat! Blat! We were supposed to be weeding out insurrectionists, Julian snapped. By burning an entire quarter full of innocents? Julian threw his hands into the air. You know what? Why do I bother? If you're going to sympathize with the peasants, maybe I should let the captain deal with you. He turned, stalking out of the square. Wulf considered, just for a moment, leaving his helmet lying on the cobblestones, walking away, leaving the city, finding somewhere else to live, pretending that this whole problem no longer existed. Instead, he sighed, scooped up his helmet, and followed Julian out of the square.